For some reason, the Wi-Fi in this room is being really whack and not letting Nate join the call, but he's trying.
Okay. I just sent out the 1AC. Let me know when everyone has gotten it and is good to start. Here. Is everybody good? Okay, I think that's all thumbs up, right? Great. Sorry. Okay. The international order is a result of a repeating series of fictions of white futurity with script blackness is fungible flesh at a time and locked into an arctic space and able to produce alliance, achieve sovereignty, dignity, or recognition. The global order relies on the notion there is a dichotomy between a human and a black. Imperialism relies on the imagined anarchy to define who should be subjected to the sovereign. We should question violence through considering a problem of time, not singular instances of violence, or rather violence intentionally woven together through imagining, leading to a materialization of violence. The accumulation of labor through nationalism is a tool of the international order. Mass and state-based justifications under normative imaginings, it is impossible to recognize black flesh as human, but through an imagination that divests from the death drive, we can break with this fiction whether our own invention of the Black International. IR presumes the sovereign subject whose existence relies upon colonized zones or gratuitous violence and property formations. In other words, the subject of IR theory depends on an asymmetrical, segregated order of nation states. This global order cannot exist without racial violence. Agatha Angelou 11. The structuring is subject to politics, the ontological, the European masculine property demands cannot be satisfied. Transferring ownership within existing structures for now begins with the imperial order of slavery and colonization. Humanist interventions can protect the sovereign subject. Constitution, the subject dependent on asymmetrical, segregated order. Response makes hostile zones to become civil states of security for some of the species occupying them are white. The belong to a given race of property relations, a precondition for any civil encounter. Gratuitous violence zone constitute the species in the colonized. The creation of colonized zones. The interstate state system, racialized whiteness and property relations require theorizing. If we are to disrupt the normative ethical order, this order, even when it claims inclusion, segregates subject of recognition from CC. Subject our position. The interstate structural worlds with no sovereign protection, able to take by force and accumulate anything from things to life itself. The basis of the interstate structure, the juristic sovereign person already secure from mutilation, enforcing the right to life of the radical individual, authorizing the idle politics and necroeconomics, enforcing right to that liberal life, but this could preclude crucial relation to the everyday continuum states of the human and non-human. It does so by deploying practices, the disfigurement and destruction, the emergence of an international order and apparatuses to make possible a particular sovereign master colonizing subject. Both war and racial bodies are already technologies inscribed the economy, slave and colonial violence to which this subject attains individuality. The construction of NATO was a consequence of the Cold War to provide security against the threat posed by the Soviet Union. Similarly, U.S. alliances within Africa were constructed to promote the United States policy of containment. After the Cold War, the U.S. admits Africa is not geopolitically strategic, discarding the alliance and sending the signal black people aren't worth protection. While both alliance structures were created for the same purpose, to secure the future, only one remains. This both commodifies blackness and renders it undeserving of protection under international structures. Historically, this logic has been used to justify the overkill of black population, starting with chattel slavery and continuing with NATO joint operations in Libya. The dismissal of black life shifts U.S. strategy abroad today. NATO's blatant opposition to AFRICOM has led it to conduct more than 1,500 airstrikes. The disregard for black life occurs from Milwaukee to Montenegro, with the U.S. leading the charge. The white future is saved for another day. Alliances with the United States require protecting the future of the U.S. in exchange for scraps. As we approach the resolution and construct our arguments about the dirty global south and contrived nuclear war scenarios, the white future is safe for another eternity. Whiteness extends itself by securing and controlling all imagined possible worlds. Between the actual and the imagined is where the politics to come is shaped. Baldwin 12. Whiteness are configured in relation to the future. Analyzing discourse of the future can reveal important insights about the ways in which white geographies are configured. Politics seeking to challenge whiteness is identified by analyzing how the future is invoking articulations. White identity. The future is rendered noble through specific practices and intervenes on the present through anticipatory logics. Politics takes shape through the conjugation of the actual and the virtual at the threshold of the real event.
Ratchet women are the witches and bitches, never tripping over being called bitches and witches. True believers, the ratchet never trust in their God that much. We refuse a dream that we did not conjure for ourselves, a nightmare, a spell malevolently cast.
Black feminized labor operates simultaneously as the material base for American imperialism and the symbolic referent for struggles to fulfill democracy's purpose. Translation of black women's public selves into abstract liberal principles keeps black women locked in a trap of predatory citizenship. Instead, you should treat black feminist theorizing as a concrete universal point of articulation for world building away from parasitic fungibility. Jackson 20. Western colonialism is a hegemonic imperial project that rests on othering the United States and alienate groups of color, also facilitating the invention and preservation of new social norms around gender and sexuality. For black women, full incorporation, the stereopublic citizenship can sit at odds with their personal selves. The state not only shapes the normative standards of citizenship, but also simultaneously dictates when and how that citizenship will be granted. Public citizenship and private self-making long been a discord for black men. Black men are denied full citizenship in the American Imperial Project. The context within which black men's citizenship becomes legible. Black men's public selves, become mechanisms for the articulation of the imperial state. Black men remain resistant to the American Imperial Project through a process of private self-making. The process which resists hegemonic ways of being. The self remains a set of autonomy, individual choice, the fungibility of commodity, or understanding the images of surface upon which the master and the nation come to understand themselves. Co-constitutive nature of imperialism, race, gender, and class in the United States is isolated in black women under the control of the American Imperial Project. Black women's efforts towards self-making are often response to systems of oppression that set out to delimit their autonomous creation of the self. The impact is a perpetual war on blackness, in which blackness as chaos is constituted within liberal institutions and hunted by them as a threat to survival. Jackson 18, order chaos has been essential to man as a dynamic system. The idea of chaos as an external threat to a linear universe. Order and chaos is interwoven. Black and people are recursively conceived as a chaotic threat, encroaching from the margins of a universalist system of order. The logic of an anti-black imaginary blackness functions as external threat, the signifier of ultimate chaos against which man has been able to vertically institute and hegemonically figure itself into the heroic sign of order. Order's dependence on the abject figures constitutive to in the systemic historical conditions of its emergence and renewal. A signifier of blackness, the ultimate connotes both finality, maximum resistance. A monocroud connotes a working system that cannot have a determined and noble outcome. The ontological absence of black female, a silent social subject to the inclusion of modes of being, feeling, knowing. The iconicity of the black female body and the canonized discourses of humanism, biocentrism. The causality of the human is a linearly hierarchical social system is assigned to the order of matter itself. The black female body has functioned as a trope of disorder, condition of economies of value, affect, and desire, consolidated fields of meaning, in order of replicating hermeneutics, mutate its terms, and bring about another mode of science altogether, a figuratively coded boundary maintaining system, the black female body.
But bitches' thighs not closing, because someone not she, supposing and supposing that she and them shouldn't be steady composing, without bankrolling, without temperance controlling, because we all Jones in. Because capitalism and democracy be stingy with portions. You must refuse a dream that you did not conjure for yourself.
Against this tradition, Asia and I speak the truth of the resolution and speak the betrayal into this very community. Thus, we affirm truth-telling as the limiting of conditions of activation of the USFG's alliance commitments with Japan, the Republic of Korea, NATO member states, and the Philippines against the idea of a perfect set of language games to affirm the resolution. We assert the unspeakability of the resolution. Truth-telling allows black women to slip in and out of an anti-black world, to live outside of space and time. This act is fugitive by nature and deconstructs anti-blackness. Hall 20, black women's truth-telling cannot transform anti-blackness to divide the authority of anti-blackness via communicative access to slip out of frame to presume it elsewhere, not the current time and place when it's forced to live in. When black women exercise their truth-telling capabilities, they challenge the notion of the human. It is an acknowledgement of anti-black understanding of the human. What is not human is not eligible to be citizen and seen as a danger to white civil society. Black women's treatment as fleshy commodity reiterates how undeserving we are of full-on state protection and rights as citizens. A fugitive practice of freedom. Affirm one's blackness despite the pathology not only resists images permeating the white social imaginary, but also the structures, conditions, and logic that employ to preserve white supremacy. Claim one's blackness is to be engaged in a practice of fugitivity. Rhetoric refusal. Asada Shakira demonstrates a refusal to stay in the frame designed for her. Slipping in and out of anti-black frames are refuting labels violently. Shakira offers in elsewhere where black people can imagine lives and elsewhere not predetermined by brutal, vicious crimes. In an anti-black world, reimagine black women's citizenship as a vision of the death of anti-black capitalist relations. The AF is the first step to decolonizing the classroom away from white supremacist liberalism and produces healthy discomfort to breed down whiteness. This proves the value of our pedagogy in the debate space. Hannah 19. They accuse us of not doing theory, even though a more critical analysis to show that we are creating theory of these lived experiences. Students and professors of color have lost its battles, succumbing to illness and early death, psychic racial violence waged against women, queer of color colleagues. The academia was not created for us. We create self-actualized spaces for solidarity and survival, yet we also fight to transform our rage into something meaningful, something more than survival. Pedagogies of crossing allow us to break through inherited boundaries of geography, nation, episteme, and identity that permeate the multiple operations of power, gendered and sexualized power that is simultaneously race and class. While healthy discomfort in the decolonized classroom can be painful, it can be beneficial for students of all races, ethnicities, and identities. The decolonized one resists a free market approach to classroom discussion where we assume the classroom participants have equal opportunity to engage. Pedagogies in the flesh require us to do the opposite. The otherization of black female flesh works against the logics of liberal humanism. Only a refusal to operate within the order of man solves. Malaklu 18, liberal humanism revealing itself as anti-black Afro-pessimism compels us to call for a political orientation, particularity of the black feminine. Spillers describes the black feminine, zero degree of social conceptualization. Black feminine occupies a feminized or penetrable, hyper-vulnerable other, disrupts the concept of the social itself. Unreality, the black woman must confront originates in the historical moment at which hierarchies of power empowered meets in the black female. The flesh-making violence predates the political economy, political economic violence of captivity, incriminates history, female flesh on gender, and clarifies historical positionality, superseding underwrite identity categories. Black feminine exists outside of the historical frame. Man's chronopolitical cover for humanism racism, humanism, plastics, so that its folds expand black female subject and discourses of sexuality go in hand, and regarding the black ungendered subject and the question of hegemony, unveil the ontological elements. Black social life finds refuge in black femininity because the immateriality of gender. Black instance not the fault of metaphysics of racial blackness, the invaginated femininity. He cannot reject his femininity without simultaneously rejecting his blackness. Black feminine conjures other ways of being and knowing, remain unrecognizable or unintelligible to our current common sense. Black feminine gets sanctuary to black life away from humanism, Stephen Reach. The black feminine rages against the machine to disarticulate the historical categories. Good for Cross. Here, just, here, yeah, thank you.
Good. Are you good?
Yeah, I'm good, whatever.
Okay. The Hannah evidence describes a decolonized classroom by focusing on pedagogies of the flesh. What is a pedagogy of the flesh, and how is that the F?
Okay. A pedagogy of the flesh would be one that relates to subject position, specifically in the context of the 1AC and our reading of that. The 1AC is a pedagogy of the flesh in that through our performance, through the ways in which we insert our politics into the debate space.
Another question, how does that decolonize the classroom?
That uses lived experience.
How does that decolonize the classroom?
Yeah.
Space still hella colonial, like what?
So we use lived experience to inform the arguments that we make. Our argument about decolonizing the classroom is that currently academia is structured against women and queer people of color. Our argument is that has created tons of like real life horrible impacts, illness, early death, all of which are a direct result of the way that academia and the university currently function. Our argument is that by inserting our politics into this space, we are able to create spaces for pedagogies of the flesh informed by lived experience and places away from that kind of overwriting of academia. And that is kind of what we do in the classroom.
Okay, got you. The first piece of Jackson evidence describes the use of a sort of notion of feminized labor to produce new world building projects. What do those look like?
Use of feminized here. That looks like the 1AC.
How is that actualized?
How is that actualized? Our argument is that the way we talk about things within the debate space and the narratives within the debate space actualize the world. Our claim is that if we change the way that things are discussed within the debate space and if we insert our narratives into the debate space, that is generative. I.e. Dawn Wooten, someone who told or who practiced truth-telling by revealing ICE detention centers and the massive abuses that they were committing against the women that they held. We'd say that she is a great example of the politics of the 1AC being actualized.
If that's true, those ICE facilities are still there and still doing hella amounts of violence. Why vote F?
I would question why you reduce our entire political theory to solely one instance. Our argument is not that doing truth-telling once automatically gets rid of like every single thing, but it still guts into the process. It has made it materially harder for ICE to actually like instantiate this violence because now.
How? Has it made it harder for ICE to effectuate that violence?
Because of the proliferation of the truth. It is significantly easier to do something if nobody knows you are doing it. If there is like a response to this, obviously that makes it significantly more difficult for ICE to continue.
Okay, yeah, I think that's all I need.
Awesome. It's been sent. It's one off in the F. Give me the stand. You're good. Just in case my dad's watching the live stream. Hi, Dad.
That's so wholesome.
Yeah, he debated at UCO like 30 years ago.
Good shit.
Hey, Dad, what's up?
I don't know if he's watching. I think he is, but we'll see. Yeah, so everyone have the document? All right. Latoya, did you say you were ready? Okay. Awesome. All right. Well, I'll start in a few seconds then. Settler colonialism is the permeating structure of the nation state which requires the elimination of indigenous life and land via the occupation of settlers, the appropriation of land turns natives into ghosts and chattel slaves and excess labor. The structural analysis is the necessary condition of violence as tucking in 12. The friends of the settler colonial nations are to require a mode of total appropriation of indigenous life and land. Settler colonialism is different from other forms of colonialism that settlers come with the intentions of making a new home on the land, home again, the assist of the settler sovereignty over all things that ignore. Settler colonialism will not help to envision the shift of decolonization by taking a settler colonial context. Settlers make indigenous land on the new home and capital. Destruction of indigenous relations to land represents a profound epistemic ontological cosmology of violence. Is violence is not to poorly contain the arrival of settlers reassert each day of occupation. Settler colonialism is a structure and not an event. Land is remade into property. Human relationships, land are restricted to the relationship with the owner to his property. Indigenous peoples must be erased, made into settler colonialism involves the subjugation of forced labor of chattel slaves whose bodies and lands become property and are kept landless. Settlers are not just white decolonization is a metaphor. Allows people to equivocate these contradictory decolonialisms, which decolonization and empty set of our decolonization. The settler colonial concepts must involve repatriation of land. Simultaneously, the right condition of land in relation to land have always been differently understood. Settler colonialism decolonization implicates and unsettles everyone, and an analytic of racialization reduces indigenous people to the transit of modernity and thus denied their agency and status, partaking in banishment. That's burden 11. Colonization and racialization have been conflated, making racism and colonialism the duties of youth empowered by the United States. Racialization and colonization were simultaneously other objectives. Entire people's name and slave is removed and killed in the name of partisan capitalism, historical political processes, secured white properties, such as and privilege, trade, and racial conflict. Two, historical processes are enmeshed, dropping into colonization as a man such as destructive religions obfuscate the distinction between the two systems, dominance and doors, complicity to amid both theorization, racialization, and pursuit of equal rights and enfranchisement, tended to be on the side of racial inclusion, exclusion, large part of liberal, multicultural, and significant failure to grapple with the fact that such a neutral system first reinstalled the original colonial entry, conflation of racialization and colonization, indigeneity, and racial categories dependent upon blood logics that undermines the institutions of settler colonialism when they offer assimilation and colonizing nations of preparation of genocide and that defense nations. The larger concerns that conflation means the territoriality of controls assigning colonization, the racial body police, police, and the degrees of whiteness of this paradigm. American Indian national section is already self-determination and land rights. Disappeared U.S. territorialized indigenous identity, of racial identity, system of colonized indigenous states between internal ethnic minorities within the colonized nation state. The affirmation of this desire of freedom and inhabited by the forgetting of this industrial possibility. Every narrative is articulation of freedom haunted by bureau and the violence of forgetting freedom dialectic was arrested simultaneously on spatial slicing them free as the unfree as exteriority, positioning the condition of slavery and interested by the Americans as a trivial contradictions to which Western freedom affirms and results of Southern might collapse in the indigenous American slavery, the four-continent settler colonialism, which is such an intimacy is turning on labor and not, it's not just forgotten or related, it becomes the very ground in which the other three continents struggle independently for freedom, justice, and equality. The only role with the disadvantage to the racialization to the one equivalent that actors' their ability to die is important, so important labor can make use of the lands indigenous people in the new world cannot give rise to the historical agency in which status in which the economy of affirmation or forgetting because they are transit through the dialect of subject and object occurs depend upon a historical evasion of the concepts of indigenous peoples and strictly tied to the dispossession of original owners and the assumption of white possession, the ongoing conditions of settler colonialism, indigenous people risk demon colonialism resolved. And the affirmative is an ideological intervention that remains indebted to colonization. Decolonizing the classroom as per their Hannah evidence is an attempt to decolonize your mind. This becomes a stand-in for genuine indigenous sovereignty. Truth-telling is a political strategy, understands these shifts, and the political is metaphor. That's tucking in 12. Decolonizing the mind is the first not only step toward overthrowing colonial regimes, a settlement to innocence, decultivation, consciousness over there, as if it were the soul activity, decolonization, law constitutes the same for relinquishing stolen land, stolen land as relinquished critical conscious and not disrupt settler colonialism. Freedom is not mentally generated, particularly in false self-policy, satisfied questions of what is colonization. In North America, settlers somebody imposes central the derivation, language, racial, religion, and property in specific ways. Decolonization must be thought on these particular ways. Decolonization, not evangelization, nor a desire to put back in security. Decolonization is the root for the repatriation of indigenous land and life. Decolonization, not an for social justice. The pursuit of critical consciousness can be settlement with innocence and aversion, which relieves the settler feelings of guilt and still the need to give a land of power, privilege, and the affirmative intervention into a firmer world building through truth telling is the setting of the colonizers that renders native life unbreathable. That's buried in 11. Any instant addition possibility to enforce the soul that the person's physical in the population, the deterrorization of the people in the population of very nearly a defining condition. The experience and historical experience when it's like religious ceremonies consider whether indigenous people are considered part of the present in order for life to be durable, it needs to be faceable to this and then test face 11 the tense in the future answer so that we might say here in the land, but like a possibility in the future answer in which any is already been decolonizing that any is unlimitable and not really the limitable people, but not remediable. Driven cause of people knowledge to see the grapple of the logic commencement separating up in these policies, creating unlivable, unreadable conditions, possible sites of intervention depending on the interrogation, the impulses in the world of settling the war, setting the work to the colonizing, the work is reconfigure the world so it might be kinder and gentler in the world and more possible lived in grief. Within this debate should be a momentary suspension of exceptionalism. This avoids reducing colonization to racialization in the reverse. Exceptionalism prevents native studies and black studies from full overtime the mechanics of fascism. That's Leroy 16. Rather than framing an exclusion, the unfortunate fact that to be remembered by inclusion of the nation, indigenous law theory of conceptual racial racial slavery, the very conditions, possibility, the inclusion, and solution, both myths, same set violence and errors. This sense of possibility and to be redressed exclusion claims are incompatible. Each field reduces the other. Liberal multicultural in these theories cannot fully account for the messiness of black and indigenous terms of one another in the USA way. If scholars suspend such claims in order to consider the impacts that's worked out for understanding the impacts of slavery, early days form of racialization, colonialism, do not self-subordinate slavery in the realm of multiculturalism led kingdom to the past and particularly in the face of settler colonialism, black racialization and trans was settled origin, not merely adjacent to the field theory as black racialization, whether it precludes a serious engagement with indigenous position, blackness is solution in the category of the human rights and nobles of the loss. A sovereign can only be framed as a less subordinate ground, while this may be a generative theoretical claim that lends it to sexual coherence and such and self-affirming of slavery and anti-blackness is simply not historically accurate. Thus, the only alternative is one of decolonization. That's tucking Yang in 12. An ethnic incommensurability and settlements in contrary to legislation would motivate settlements and legislation by rescuing settler normalcy, rescuing settler future reconciliation from what decolonization will let the concept in the decolonization of the settler incommensurability not question need not be answered in order for decolonization is a framework decolonization not accountable for settlers until the future decolonization is accountable for indigenous sovereignty and prejudice. These sense of not fully moving can be as long as decolonization range better way, but metaphor require a dangerous understanding of uncriminality, uncoalition, coalition policy, ethnic incommensurability requires means a relinquished settler future, men in the hope that settlers may want to be permissible and native people, native future allowed to be lived with the settler nation. God, these are the unwritten possibilities made possible by ethnic incommensurability. Decolonization offers a different perspective to human and civil rights approach is just an unsettling one rather than complementary one. Decolonization on ands and elsewhere. And our ground of relationality is mutually exclusive to the proprietary logic of settler colonialism. Exceptionalizing human activity requires the inevitable reproduction of genocide and slavery that's burden all in 18. Ground of relationality situated in relation to and from the relationalities in which the non-human materiality, line of agential significance, always as they see the work conception of the human relationalities when land is understood not as property, but as relation with the agency is itself, serve as an ontological tradition for a different concept than the political delivery piece of contract and land as a social relation rather than the set of boundaries of politics and indigenous sovereignty, black revolution, movement to rebuild capacity for relationality rather than the exclusivity or inclusion, liberal freedom, self healthy appropriation, collective life mode, refuses to do repair and a black identity dispossession and set offers way to see the debt as this ownership settler colonialism becomes a counter-carnival decenter bodies the side of pure labor, those struggling against colonialism and turn away from the colonial state and find transformative parts of that, uphold the relations rights parts of that shape our engagement with the human and non-human world, the land right in order to be present at the way and known and being in the world. There's more spent than those on top of the back order. That's the human is exceptional indigenous intervention bringing on knowledge and power in ways that through indigenous returns the land. The loss of land is not just a loss of sovereignty, it's a loss of relation with the land. Itself activates, fosters, and nourishes in space and place give black life meaning in a world where blackness is deemed as ungeographic. This debate is a space where we can have those contextual conversations that reveal commonality and shared visions of the future. That's tucked it all in 14. The black line report to inform the analyze story of the relationship between black people, land and place in the space and place of black lives meaning in the world that's black population their city geographies ungeographic the false blackness and seen only in human inhuman term production of black spaces set of location that were already that are explicitly producing racism, captivity, and economic profit, colonial geographies required displacement places that black people have always experienced occupied and constructed place of priority, prejudice to recognize that black geographies have been destroyed in vital landscapes of domination that black imaginations and mappings are evidence of struggle over social place. Black people telling stories of personal geographies. We identify significant ranges in the relationship with land. The idea that black people's relationship with land is ungeographic then presumes an oversimplified relation that there's a single history of blackness having. The space is named about the name of these findings of confusion brings it close to known history of visions of the future sense of learning, create, articulate, geographic, and everything encompasses both the emotional space and something that exists in the geography placed on the new ways of understanding relation to land. Black lines are already geographic being located in the experience of belonging in a specific place, irrespective of its display of migration or location. Case. You should vote negative on presumption they have no reverse causal plan for resolving the material limitations of their impacts that describe no method, material challenge of violence. They criticize less and re-articulate the F in every speech and get our best offense. So you should ask yourself what voting F does to resolve violence. If you can't explain what the F does, what they solve, how it's functions, or why the F ballot is key to vote negative on presumption, even if we lose anything else. And the demand of the 1AC falls into the dialectic direct conditions that consolidates the settler university, even if the content of their F might be refusal of functions that academic recognition and form. This turns the case of fields only because any solvency argument is forced complicity in a colonized space as Grande 18. University functions as institutions with the capitalist and religious mission, the settler take Marian's history, dispossession, exclusion, forces, assimilation, and integration. The academy is both the beneficiary and defender. Same social rank and offers that transform America to the slave trade deficit indigenous nations in America. The academy never stood apart from American slavery and feticide. Besides the church and states of civilization built on oddities, the academy also never stood apart from the genocide and dispossession of indigenous peoples, all which illuminates the history. Universities, history is a long time to spirit and perpetuating one's purpose. The desire was not for a retold opportunity to burn house, but rather to build a new house. They just settled university to only remove to a place not long before the revolutionary redistributing aims of black radicalism were explained and absorbed within the project of liberal populism, substituting anti-capitalism for people to recognition, inclusion, promise. Project weights on the serious and on purpose made of those who remain outside our by the university recognition policies made impede indigenous struggle to decolonize the restrain for more radical religion of black study which struggle within the needs of the university settler stays and raise to recognition being one of them played dispossessed peoples and innovating need for to change the underlying power structure distorts of recognition garner what appeals they provide a means for neatly breaking what are fundamentally complex and ongoing sets of power relations the growing way of college university seeking to prevent selling involvement in the slave trade is failure to restructure material conditions recognition continues to serve the dominant framework for addressing the persistence of structural racism studying activists now only participating in the domination of preparing such discourses of recognition no one come for the collective action is the capital settler logic situate when asym relations of power in the first place. We'll mark the card there at first place.
Okay, good for cross.
Just give me, sorry, that was really close enough. Just give me like 1 second
Yeah, yeah.
to sit.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Okay. Um,
All right, now I'm good.
Okay, awesome. Can the alt ever result in the AF?
The alternative is not a floating pick, but we think the alternative solves the affirmative's impacts.
Got it. Thank you. What about Black people who can't access grounded relationality? Because
That's our point. Black people can.
Your point is that Black people can. I'm asking about Black people who can't as a result of being pushed out of the state.
I don't understand. That's not our argument at all. Like push people out of the state. I don't understand.
Okay.
Grounded relationality is about Black people's specific personal geographies. It has nothing to do with the state.
Okay. How does your theorization explain the ways in which Black women are hypersexualized?
Yeah. So a couple of reasons. Actually spatiality. Oh, you want to take it? Okay, never mind. Grant wants to take it.
So first, we think that is a symptom of the problem of settler colonialism and anti-Blackness. Our argument is that settler colonialism is a triadic relation that produces Black folks to experience the positions of violence. Our argument is that those things are the reason that form of anti-Blackness occurs is because in order to make the world, there must be a sort of clearing, and then Black people must be turned into property. That is our argument.
Okay.
No. I need to get this very clear. The link here is that we have sequenced violence wrong.
No.
What is the link?
The link argument happened in the 1AC cross-ex when you all said that the AF is a mechanism of truth-telling that reveals violence in order to solve violence. We think that is exactly what Tuck and Yang are criticizing when they describe a decolonization as a metaphor, which is exactly what you've done, which we've impact trained.
Okay. Tuck and Yang describe decolonization as a metaphor being problematic because it does not translate into material decolonization. What does the alternative do to translate into material decolonization?
An ethic of incommensurability is an orientation towards material actions and land repatriation specifically. And then as an internal link, it also functions as an internal link to the grounded relationality, because by centering land repatriation. That's not the question I'm
asking though, because
that's the answer to your question, because like grounded relationality is the necessary step in order to resolve the impasse that you just explained.
I'm asking what the spill up claim that the 1NC makes is.
Yes, exactly. Okay. We don't think that anything necessarily happens outside of debate, obviously, just like nothing happens after you vote F, but we think that having an ethical orientation and an affective orientation towards decolonization results in like forms of land repatriation. It's a form of organization amongst Black and Indigenous people that we think is good.
Okay, got it. The Leroy evidence, what does it mean to refuse exceptionalism?
It means to refuse the specific like binaries that the 2AC is going to talk about like how Black and Indigenous studies are separate from each other. Our argument is that the 1AC has already exceptionalized through their theorizations of things like pedagogies of the flesh, whereas we think that our conversations are not exceptional.
Gotcha.
Okay. I'm sending the document now, but it's going to be the case, then the criticism. I'm like actively in the process of eating a cough drop. I'm going to quickly bite into it very aggressively.
If that doesn't like perfectly just describe debate, having to chomp on the cough drop before the speech.
Yeah, I just didn't want you all to have to listen to ASMR me trying to not be sick during the 2AC. Okay. Jaleesa, are you here? Okay, sounds good. Looks like everyone's ready. Oh, Toya's not ready. Got you. Okay, sounds good. There. Sorry. Okay, I'm good to go. Did someone try to say something to me? Okay. Truth telling is an act of fugitivity that allows Black women to challenge the conditions that have been placed upon their existence. It's not false hope and has very real consequences for the material conditions with which people exist on when and practice truth telling in opposition to forced sterilizations that ISIS enter into censors, which proves truth telling is uniquely disruptive to structural antagonisms. There are two impacts that YAF solves. First is white futurity. Investments in normative structures of alliances reify the security of the white future, which justifies notions of civil violence. Second is anti-Black imperialism. U.S. imperialism structures both domestic and international structures of politics, which renders Black women commodities. We must refuse a dream that we did not conjure for ourselves in favor of a new world, an act that allows Black women to discipline out of hegemonic spaces of violence in a world that allows us to create a process beyond this one, a world in which Black women write the conditions of their own agency. The question of the debate is who provides a better strategy for Black women to navigate spaces of anti-Black violence, because we have conceded that Black women are also in a precarious position. If we win that there's a risk that anti-Blackness continues to oppose the alternative, then you should vote affirmative. If we win that there are Black women who find the value in Black spirituality, the material conditions of the affirmative that turns the alternative to, or as they expect to create some value for Black women, but their analysis sees Black agency to white futures. We have a lot of theorization on how anti-Blackness operates. First is that Black women are positioned in an order of chaos that requires both a constant death and a lack of access to life. The affirmative challenges this by using the position Black women are in to disarticulate structures of liberal humanism. That's the Malaklu evidence. The alternative cannot solve it because it criminalizes Black women for positing survival strategies in the debate phase. Second is which the Hannah evidence says that people have literally died from trying to get pedagogies trying to get pedagogies to think through the violence that they experience. The second impact, or the second argument is that the public and private self-making that the app is how Black women are forced to separate their public and private selves in the status quo. The alternative can only understand contingent instances of violence or anti-Blackness, which is the opposite of the one I see which is proven in the one I see. But the alternative can only understand contingent instances of violence, which leads to battle fatigue, because Black women will have no dialect to express the specificity of the experiences of anti-Blackness that they have. Truth telling is that dialect. The first argument that they make is a presumption claim. Presumption is anti-Black because it assumes that the function of the affirmative or that it assumes that the status quo is better than any chance of disrupting anti-Blackness. Presumption flips after when we're discussing anti-Blackness, because you should risk more to get into that process. We don't have to win a reverse causal claim here. The example of Don Wooden and Asada's daughter should be enough to show the innate value of the one I see. And there's no presumptive value if we win even if they win their theorization of how settler colonialism operates. They have not identified they've not just proven how we've identified our anti-Blackness is articulated through alliances, which means it's still try or die on the affirmative. Second is that negative on presumption links to all of our offense about weaponizing theories against Black female survival strategies, which means their analysis can never get back at solving for Black women. This is the grande evidence that they read is misunderstanding of the one I see on the most basic level, because we don't seek to include humanism. We attempt to build worlds outside of it, and the one I see is not merely a recognition politics. If we win our claims about debate being generative, then we absolutely translate into material action with a Don Wooden card that or the Don Wooden example I extended above. Go to the criticism. At the top, prioritize strategies to navigate spaces of violence. Frame this debate around truth telling as a moment of care and retrieval that is necessary to imagine possible futures that operate to create spiritual energy to craft around a collective care for Black women to be able to engage in the grounded relationality of the alternative. Race neutral discussions about colonialization are bad, because if it's easier for them to solve the harms of the affirmative, that's because they haven't analyzed the specificity of anti-Black violence. This means truth telling is a psychological prerequisite necessary to engage a kind of analysis that they think is good. Permutation: let Black women tell the truth about grounded relationality. Filter the link debate through the magnitude of the links. If they're small already happening, then the permutation is sufficient to resolve. If permutation do both, all the links are links of omission justifies a permutation. They could talk about violence against negative people too without saying that the act shouldn't have happened. Theoretically makes it impossible. This is from a theoretical standpoint, it makes it impossible to be of affirmative, because they can advocate for things that are plain plus justifies intrinsic permutations. We need them to compete against the alternative permutation. We theorize anti-Blackness settlement and imperialism. They need to have a prescription action that disproves the affirmative. This requires them to win that. You can never talk about Black women or racialization to win the debate. If they win the plan counter plan, then they should lose to the permutation. Black female bodies are the coordinates to where colonization and anti-Blackness come together to build a settlement plantation. That's key in 13. Winter pushes back the curtains and positions Blackness, which was previously positioned off stage directly on the stage of epic drama of conquest. Blackness is required to establish the terms of conquest. The epistemological revolution of liberal humanism's human and non-human negation requires the presence of the Negro. Winter insists that we consider a triadic model, white, native, and Black, to understand the relations conflict between humans that it would bring forth the notion of the modern human and informed conquest. This kind of analysis of conquest moves Blackness into our visual and conceptual frames, and it offers a new simultaneous view of originary of violence of conquest. Winter merges encomienda and settler and colonial spatial formation with the plantation and spatial formation of slavery. The encomienda plantation systems bring two forms power together. Winter's merging of the two spatial and subject ontology producing formations creates a discursive moment where we can think of about the plantation as having a relation to the native to the space of native genocide, exploitation, and settlement. The settlement plantation is a staging ground where the black female slave body is produced and simultaneously a product of black female slave body. The black female slave body can be an ambiguous and opaque space that requires the decolonized vantage of the simultaneous site to begin to apprehend its analytic and spatial power as a unit of space. That encomienda plantation functions as a space of productive power that clears and closes the native, that makes a slave fungible or a pure state of flux, and produces the settler master. As we know, the settler settlement plantation simultaneously functions as a space that eliminates native existence and produces a slave as a non-human property. The settlement plantation functions as a spatial unit that turns black bodies into non-human bodies. The settlement plantation also turns black non-human bodies into property and into forms of space or spatial potential. The settlement of plantation that the black female body is a dialect tension, and there's a link turn the structural position of theorizing settler colonialism requires positioning of slavery as a space of metaphor, absent starting for the point from the point of non-positionality of blackness and non-signification of black women's flesh. The negative alternatively ultimately fails for the reason of analogy logics. They try to account for only the permutation solves to disrupt the demarcation of both settler colonialism and anti-blackness. It's Garba and Sorrentino in 20. Affirmation of land is not a methodologically innocent, tucking and bringing the slave into the fold only to disavow its premises through access to the physical object of land. Understood relationality be turned into its total physical presence. Land is a signifier that secures the impossibility of indigenous fungibility. The telling of the footnote tucking and clarify the structural logic. Settler natives slave triad structures. Settler colonialism does not mean that settler native and slave are analogs, nor do they mutually constitute one another. Chattel slavery is described as a structural position but not an identity. Their metaphysical commitment to positivism is however, is the double variance of the roots. There's no hidden material, neither land or identity to be recovered. I'm gonna, yeah, I'll mark it out recovered. And the second Tuck and Yang card is nothing more than a cool story, bro. Links to all of our offense about how they weaponize black female survival strategies against them. The Leroy evidence proves the permutation. It says that anti-blackness and settler colonialism is co-constitutive. They haven't actually read a card that says makes any sequencing claims about the alternative theorization needing to come before the affirmative, because all of their evidence concedes that anti-blackness is just too complex to be understood through solely a settler colonial view. This means that the permutation would resolve it because the alternative links to all of our offense about black phobia. They're links about racialization. We have three answers. First is that it makes no sense because it relies on racialization to deny racialization, because it assumes that we are talking about anti-blackness when we're talking about anti-blackness, we're not also talking about settler colonialism. This means that they have to win. They have to win that we're not doing that to gain any of cohesion for the link story. To gain any cohesion for the link story, they have to create racialization. Second is the culpability to decide. We have two warrants. First is that I'm not a settler and I'm actively being punished for describing the violence that occurs to black people and the violence that occurs to natives when they have made claims that this violence is co-constitutive. If they win, they can't win the debate by saying our prescription of violence is wrong if our description to solve it is correct, which answers the reverse causal claims they make it on the case debate as well. Third is that if violence is co-constitutive, which means the link differential here is so minuscule. You can see this in the cross-sex when they talk about how we've present like forefronted an idea in the academy, and that's the thesis of the link. The genre discourse just said blackness is a structural dissociation of non-being, presuming it functions as an identity or a category of differences of violence that conceals a singular relationship of slavery. That's Douglas in 16. Contrary to man, blackness is unable to articulate itself into a genre. This exclusion sits at the nexus of violence and engenders the black female body as a disassociation. Blackness must be theorized as class, gender, and sexuality as a medium, opposed to attempting to think about blackness through class, gender, and sexuality. Totalizing violence over determines difference and sameness through slavery. Singularity is inscribed onto blackness to minimize the violence of slavery. The slave is in a singular relationship to all that the master can be race, gendered, and class and sexual. Genre discourse only manifests the violent relation that produces blackness as structurally silenced in response to every mode of being. The last argument we'll make is that their criticism of settler colonialism disinvests from the racial understandings of settlement, which can only be articulated through the register of sovereignty. This reifies the master settler paradigm of recognition that they seek to solve themselves from.
Just let me know when you're ready.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm good to go.
All right. I want to start on the last thing you just said, that should be a debate about like how sovereignties are formulated. Why are black bodies ungeographic?
So we read a couple of pieces of evidence on why this is true. The King evidence we read talks about how blackness is positioned, or like blackness's positionality relies on like I guess for settler colonialism to occur, that does require a clearing of land, but that only occurs when blackness is made fungible as a prerequisite, which is what King's writing about.
How is blackness made fungible?
Um, so I'm not really sure what your question is. We would say that blackness was made fungible through chattel slavery.
Okay, but there's obviously some sort of mechanism as to like clearing the black body of all meaning. How does that happen?
I mean, like, I don't know if you want me to describe like how the formation of like the N word happened, or like the gratuitous violence that manifests, or like what your question is.
I just wonder, how did the black body become erased to a point of fungibility and accumulation? Like what?
When black people were deemed non-human via
I thought that was the
process of
condition.
chattel.
I thought that was the
slavery.
condition as to how
What
black
is
people
the-
are deemed non-human. Like
How
are black people deemed non-human?
What do you, like, I'm confused. We think that black people are deemed non-human via like through a structure of anti-blackness. We think the world is anti-black, which deems black people not human.
Sure.
We think that started in chattel slavery. I'm kind of confused on what your question is asking.
All right, sure. I'll move on. The affirmative invests in a pedagogy of flesh. How do indigenous people access that?
How do indigenous people access a pedagogy of the flesh? I would say that indigenous people also have a pedagogy of the flesh, but we think that the 1AC forefronts a question of like the like from the starting point of black women. Like all again,
how do indigenous people do that?
Why can't indigenous people do that is my question. There's like it uses lived experiences to inform how we produce knowledge. I don't understand why native people can't use lived experiences to inform their knowledge.
Sure. So I just have like a kind of a question about the permutation. You say the permutation is black women telling the truth on ground of relationality. What does that look like?
So the point of the permutation is that if there's a risk of anti-black violence continuing post the alternative, black women being able to truth tell through that is the important way to fill that gap. So we can, if you win grounded relationality is good, solves the AF, whatever, you can't solve for all the violence because we think that your theorization obfuscates how anti-blackness works and also links back to all of your own offense versus the affirmative.
All right. Do black people have relationships to place?
We don't think so.
All right.
And it'll be the K. I know that we're waiting on some folk, but it's the order. Zach, would you hand me the stand? You're fine. Have people returned? Okay, I haven't checked yet. Okay, I think we have everyone now. The doc is sent. It's just the K, straight down. Is everyone good? Okay, I'll start. Oh, so sorry. Okay, sweet. Now I'll start. Despite the affirmative's attempt to navigate anti-Black violence, they reproduce genocidal politics through their individual and epistemic resistances that trade off with anti-colonial movements. Vote negative to reject the F's individualism in favor of a decolonial ethic that focuses on material decolonization. They say prioritize navigation strategies. This is our link argument because you attempt to sort of navigate the world but can never generate politics that makes or undoes the politics of the world that produce those forms of violence in the first place. You should evaluate this debate based on competing structures of structural analytics. It comes first. It's ethically prior. It's necessary to generate an explanation account of the entire phenomena. This also creates a reason to prefer our triadic understanding of settler colonialism and anti-blackness because it avoids collapsing one onto the other argument as they are twin antagonisms co-constituted by one another. Our King evidence says that the two are not separate but processes that stop when they collide, but rather are reproduced together, which means that only giving an account of both can resolve either. This means their analytics understanding is one that is bad level of research. Also means that politics that claim to be antagonists of this world cannot be anti-indigenous. You shouldn't sanction anti-indigenous violence in the name of navigating anti-black violence. Their abdication of the material is exactly what our Tuck and Yang evidence says reproduces the strategies of violence. The first Tuck and Yang evidence says that failure to sort of account for the particularities of violence generates that violence in the first place. They say truth-telling is a prerequisite. We will impact turn truth-telling as a methodology. The 1AC Cross-X explained truth-telling as a mechanism of revealing wherein we learn more about the world and that allows us to change our behavior. This is impact turned by 1AC number 3, the Tuck and Yang called the mind argument. It says that that mechanism of producing knowledge is a mechanism of politics is one that generates settler moves to innocence and is an aspirational politic that fails to grapple with the particularities of decolonization or other forms of violence. This is proven by the fact that all of their examples that they've listed have failed to halt the violence, which means even if it's good to navigate those things with truth-telling, it's bad because it disavows the production of those forms of violence in the first place. They say permutation do both. That links to the link argument I made above because it still includes truth-telling and attempts to reveal knowledge and information about grounded relationality that disavows the capacity of material praxis and still maintains decolonization as a metaphor. That turns the case and makes it impossible for them to win any of the permutation arguments because it doesn't have value if we win that their theorization is wrong. They say also all of the links will always turn the case because the master and the settler are the same ontological position. Robinson in 20. The settler colony is fully coextensive with the anti-black slave estate. The ontological and structural position of the settler and the master are the same because the settler colony and the slave estate required native elimination, black and African enslavement. The settler and master become structurally the same, and they say the King evidence, it goes negative. Settlement, spatiality, and place must all be theorized as central production of the human. The materialization of blackness is an ontological position. The process of ensettlement enables self-actualization of the settler, which is the key internal link to producing violence. King 13. The process of making black bodies fungible flesh or settled slaves needs to be theorized as settlement. Settlement materialized blackness is an ontological position. Process of settlement requires the making of ontological categories of occupied by the dead. Settlement allows the settler master to become human. Settlement is more than white people making a home and native people disappearing. Settlement is assemblage of technology. Process of making bodies, separate position, space, place, and claims to various forms of autonomy. Self-actualization transcends settlement as a process that enables unfettered mobility. Settlement structures the settler's relationship with the native, the black, and the nature as negation. Settlement creates a complex ontological position constituted by both states of stasis and flux. Black bodies are always sliding into states of fungibility. The flux and instability enable the settler to experience the self-actualizing state of stability and transcendent autonomy. The ontological position of the native and the black are positions of fixed flux. These positions do not occupy the universal, liberal, and humanizing frames of time and space. They are fixed, rooted in place of elimination, expanding the use of settlers on, and in pursuit, the settlers unfettered group is predicated on a fixed flux, belongs to a certain place. The European, on the other hand, can be of place but not incarnated by it, like the native. The settler in indigeneity offers them unfettered mobility. The clearing shapes blackness as it carves out settlement plantation. The clearing transformed the bodies of black settling cleared blacks of all spatial coordinates that could make them human states and flux, makes them make space impossible. It cannot occupy make space possible. Cannot occupy existing continual state of liminality and change. Black female is a place making unit, but not in place, and its links to humanism, morality, and identity are part of the humanist project. The humanist concept of places occupied by the baggage of morality, identity, opposites, exclusion of black bodies in a space of fixed flux have no place. Through humanist articulation, the place universal abstract notions of space becomes humanized and exclusionary. Settlement is not just the process of physical location. What the subjugation and psychic fixing of others into a concealed is a simultaneous process of settler rooting in order to launch the subjugation of psychic fixing of others into a state of flux. In order for the settler to transcend into a state of humanness as the ultimate self-actualizing human, the settler can overcome the particularity of place and launch the universal and abstract space humanness to be savage or to be black, to exist in the realm of no time and no space. That turns the next argument on the Sorrentino evidence, because we have an analysis of the ways in which slavery operates. So their evidence does not defend the use of metaphor as resistance strategy, which is the only link argument I need to win. We agree that blackness and nativeness are not identities, but structural position, which means there's no link to this argument. And it scripts land as a Westphalian notion of control, which is impact turned by our 1 and C bird evidence that describes land as relation, which proves that they have sort of interpolated native life in violent ways, which turns their offense about metaphor. It's also, our Tuck and Yang evidence is also correct about the structure of reality, which means even if they win a link argument to it, it doesn't mean that they're correct, because we are winning the sort of theory of reality that structures the capacity for violence to occur. They say the Leroy evidence is a permutation argument. No, it's not. It's a criticism of the use of exceptionalizing logic, which the F has done in numerous places. First, the 2AC describes the violence of black female flesh as radically otherized and generates the incapacity to make the world. This can only render native life as a lesser register of violence that reproduces a form of exceptionalism that you should suspend in this debate. Because the app participates in that exceptionalizing frame, which collapses into liberal multiculturalism and the call for inclusion, which reproduces the logic of human rights abuses that produce the violence in IR in the first place, as per their evidence, which means there's only a risk of offense for us. They say the racialization argument. They say it simultaneously relies on race. Our argument is yes, race is a particular category, but understanding the world through racialization is what mystifies the capacities of native life. Their theory of power is one that writes native life out of existence through the transit of modernity. That's the 1 and C bird evidence. This isn't culpable because it's not that your structural position committed something bad, but rather your analysis of that structure and the ways in which you've thought about the world and attempted to sort of generate those prescriptions are incorrect and produce violence, which means it's not a question of culpability for something you didn't do, but rather about the ways in which the 1AC and its analysis of violence is a bad one. The world building argument, I think, is also the racialization argument has numerous examples. The Baldwin evidence describes whiteness as the capacity to produce futures, which disavows any other orientation of the future and makes future building impossible, which trades off the alternative. A pedagogy of the flesh, as per Cross-X, relies on this mechanism of racialization. The Jackson evidence is our link to the world building evidence. The second piece of bird evidence describes world building as a process of slow death, the desire to build anew in the wreckage of civil society, rather than attempting to sort of reclaim those structures as per our alternative, reproduces the native as a sort of backdrop of disappearance that can launch new self-actualizing forms of knowledge, which is a desire for forms of settler transcendence. Additionally, our argument at the top answers this sort of culpability we called you a settler argument. Argument is not that they are a settler, but rather that they have engaged in modes of subjectivity that have that particular desire for transcendence, which is a bad one. The Jackson evidence also contextualizes all of our link arguments about racialization and exceptionalism. The Jackson 18 evidence in particular says blackened people are recursively conceived as a chaotic threat encroaching from the margins of a universalized system of order. The logic of an anti-black imaginary, blackness functions as an external threat, signifier of ultimate chaos. The object figures constitutive. That also turns all of their offense about why they can sort of produce new knowledge. All of their desires to sort of reconceptualize debate is the logic of adoption and absorption that make decolonization impossible. Tuck and Yang 12. Ease with which the language of decolonization has been superficially adopted into education, subletting prior social critical methodology. Decolonization, which we assert as a distinct project from other civil and human rights-based social justice projects. Decolonization wants something different than those forms of just educational research. It is not uncommon to hear as it figures almost casually to read decolonize our schools or use decolonizing methods or decolonize student thinking. Metaphor invades decolonization. It kills the very possibility of decolonization. Research whiteness resettles theory extends, in a sense, sustains a settler future. Market settler future. It's like the last little chunk. Okay. Cross-X.
You good to go?
Yeah.
Okay. My first question is about your arguments about racialization.
Yeah.
I guess if a white Indigenous person calls a Black Indigenous person a nigger, how does your your conceptualization of racialization account for that?
Well, yeah, that's a lot. Our argument is that
yeah, it is a lot. It is violence that happens too.
Sure. So our argument is a couple of things. First, our argument is not that we can never use racialization ever, but when we base our theories of the world around a racialized logic, it produces a sort of transit of modernity that disavows the capacity for native life to sort of exist in those spaces.
That kind of confuses me because you make a lot of arguments about how anti-Blackness and settler colonialism are co-constitutive. If this is true, why is the 1AC talking about anti-Blackness and obfuscation of settler colonialism?
all of the link arguments prove that your particular analysis.
The link arguments seem very circular to me because they still rely on this notion that talking about anti-Blackness singularly is is an obfuscation of settler colonialism, but all of your evidence seems to indicate that you should talk about them in conjunction to each other, or that talking about anti-Blackness does in some ways grapple with the specificity of settler colonialism. I'm still confused.
Disagree with that second part. Our evidence says that talking about it in conjunction with one another is good, but framing one as exceptional over the other is bad, which is what we think we've done. That's clear evidence.
So because we talked about Black women, we have framed Black women as exceptional, or the violence that they experience as exceptional?
No, our argument is not that you can never talk about Black women, but rather that you should not produce strategies and understandings of the world that are based on the exceptionality of Black women, which is something that we've impacted.
I guess in the alternative, should Black women have individual identities of violence that they only experience?
Sure. We think the alternative describes particular ways of relating to those forms of violence and producing new sort of strategies to combat that. Our grounded relationality arguments are a good example of that Zach's about to explain.
So just I guess the last question I have is a little bit of a shift. Why theorize through land as opposed to theorizing through genocide?
So that's kind of our argument, is we don't think that those two can ever be separated. We think that genocide and land are co-constitutive with one another, which is why your sovereignty K argument doesn't really make a lot of sense, because those aren't separate questions.
Okay, so I kind of understand the train of logic that says the pushing of indigenous people off of land is the act of genocide, or this is continuously happening, but I'm confused on why that would still prefer, we should still prefer an analytic of land.
The alt is not just an analytic of land. That is our point.
Okay.
The one in our cards were sent during CX. So just let me know when everyone's got them. Is anyone not ready? All right, awesome. I'll start in a few seconds then. Vote negative to endorse a decolonizing ethic of incommensurability. In simpler terms, it is a pedagogy but not analytic of land, which rejects settler tended reconciliation in favor of decolonial orientation towards politics. Our argument is that in the world of the affirmative, decolonization remains punctuated by metaphor, asterisking and creating conditional clauses to underwrite material decolonization with the settler innocence via modes of reconciliation that rescue a settler future. That's the link debate from the 2NC, which means if we just win one of our links, it means the F has invested in a model of recuperating settler futurity, which invests in native death, and the alternative solves it. Now, the ethical orientation of the alternative spills up because the alternative creates circles of collective resistance that spill into Black and indigenous cooperative modes of governance. Decolonization is constructed with the destruction of settler fascist society, which are ethic demands, and that is uniquely good because an ethic of incommensurability allows us to challenge the institutions that settler colonialism has presented itself with and remain incommensurable to them, which means we do not have to give into a settler society. This orientation gives us the internal link to grounded relationality. Being incommensurable with settlerism demands non-participation in institutions, forcing us to look towards each other for strategies of survival. It solves the unfettered mobility of settler colonialism by contesting human exceptionalism. It solves the internal link to the fungibility of Black women's labor. A theory in the flesh means one where the physical reality realities of our lives, our skin color, the land, our concrete, all concrete we grew up on, our sexual longings, all fused to create politics born on necessity. That's from their 1AC Hannett evidence, and it's a bad analytic of analyzing relation to place because it forefronts violence on the flesh as the way to analyze those relations. That's bad. It should start from the land and how spatial relations create the fungibility and accumulation of Black women's labor. That's our ground of relationality arguments from the 1NC. That's all of our spatial relation stuff at the bottom of it. And they say that the pedagogy of the flesh, we say that excludes how indigenous flesh has been theorized because it isn't one of fungibility and accumulation, but one of dispossession, which their pedagogy cannot teach anything about indigenous people. Now, their exceptionalist reading of sovereignty is based on Westphalian property relations and misidentifies the sovereign possibility of the native from the settler master perspective. The native is void and there is no possibility of humanity. That's why pedagogies of land are good to repair severed relationships for both Black and indigenous people. That's Robinson and 20. The white settler master occupies the space of the human, the Black side of the object, and non-human between those two positions. The native side of the wilderness occupies the lower space of the half-human. So the reason for the half-human position on the native side of the wilderness is found with the understanding of the grammars of native lives, genocide, loss of sovereignty, and to be able to be incorporated and be eligible in the human register, structural readjustment, wilderness, and compartmentalism of the red ontological position of clearing the genocide and loss of sovereignty, ultimately being able to recognize the nature of red life as a condition of being cleared operations as the native sovereignty existed when the colonial time would say it did not exist at all, only existed in order to be diminished by wrestling native sovereignty, the creation and serving the notion of native sovereignty is avoid Native Americans emerge barred from sovereignty of the ontological level unless we regarded as non-human occupants as far as the settlers side of anything never had sovereignty the trap for which wilderness falls in the destruction of the loss of native sovereignty, the respect of madness and never encroaching through pacific cartographic coherence is the thing itself. Native sovereignty has never been the same thing as the sovereignty of the white settler master in any future. They preserve settler colonies within the civil society, government, ontological, symbolic orders is one that very constitution avoids any notion of native self-determination. The native, the native has never been sovereign. We must first recognize that we have always been and always have been determined by the thought that the prerogative of the settlers, no possibility of structural readjustment, only relation to antagonism. The native can indeed never truly be as long as the world of the settler continues to be in. It solves the affirmative. The advocacy of the 1AC is based on the inability to speak the reality of the world of respective difference and alterity within the resolution with the solidarity between Black women in the stories and their stories unable to be told by survivors of exploitation and oppression at the hands of the United States. But our method provides the conversations necessary to speak that reality because reality has been severed by settler colonial spatial relations, and the affirmative necessarily prevents this analytic because the conversations they start are based on an analytic that erases indigeneity because they do not question the material conditions and the severed spatial relations that constitute the accumulation and fungibility of the Black body that also has different relations to the dispossession of indigeneity. That is the only, that's just why ground relationality is a better mechanism of solvency because ground relationality solves the Black feminized labor internal link. It prioritizes the experiences of Black women, particularly on this land, and how their labor is constructed, the geographies that exist today because ground relationality fosters contingent collaboration, which theorizes strategies of resistance that are non-realizable in the status quo. The alliance forged amongst Native and Black people via land create new strategies that solve all the internal links to Black feminized labor being fungible and accumulated. Now, two reasons. First, the space is no longer ownable under frameworks that view land as a gentle like the affirmative of the space in place give Black life meaning in a world where Blackness is deemed as ungeographic. Black people have, of course, always occupied and constructed place in spite of landscapes of domination that seek to sever relation due to sever relationality. Conversations are necessary to reconstruct those attachments, which produces better strategies. And the second, ground of relationality allows for locally and contextual rooted strategies for existing outside of genocidal Black institutions, bringing about change through direct action, confrontation with the state power that only the alternative can test because only the alternative can test human exceptionalism by recognizing the agential capacity of land, which the affirmative has no mechanism of doing so. And this solves Black spirituality by allowing the spiritual relations with the land to come to fruition. You can have emotional attachment to places lost by settlement while flourishing, like flourishing communities in Africa hunted by colonialism, while also having physical attachments to the land here. That's our Black geographies argument. And struggles over the meaning place at geographic dimensions, the practice of Black reclamation. The example is walking the land and having conversations about particular attachments to the places we cross, understanding Black spatial relations and how they are severed in relation to that land, how that land was used in anti-Black violence, understanding how indigenous clear and paved the way for that violence to occur on this land. Our evidence points to things like collaborating on the structure of property ownership relation to begin working and creating strategies, which is uniquely good. The dis adds to the alternative. There is no battle fatigue argument. We don't think Black women need labor to necessarily create conditions for ground of relationality. Instead, we ask that the affirmative shifts its pedagogy so that truth telling becomes closer to the truth. Black geographies exist and need to be theorized and talked about in the genre discourse. This said, we impact turn their singular theorization of Blackness. Our technical evidence from the 1AC explains that Black geographies prove that there are multiplicity of experiences that must be discussed. The Black femphobia said it doesn't link to us because we don't think there's a single Black identity like they do. The card is all about seeing all Black resistance as identity is bad. That's not what we say. We say that their pedagogy doesn't produce good strategies of resistance based on the land and culpability. Said we aren't blaming you or Black women for anything. Instead, we think that you should be held accountable for your indigenous erasure. The alternative solves it via contingent collaboration, which the affirmative can't access. We're doing Grande. Debate being gendered is even more of a reason that Grande links the F just pointed something out that they need to recognize. You should vote negative because everything they say about modernity being bad is also applied to the Academy, a foundational institution of modernity. The F breathes life back into the matrix of information, which gets commodified by the university in order to avoid materially confronting colonial structures, which just replicates all the impacts about Black feminized labor that I talked about. The 1AC's true telling just becomes a new class in some universities, so we don't have to talk about decolonization. The Affirmatives Project doesn't internally turn Grande because it gets co-opted by the university and put on brochure while they maintain anti-Black institutions. There is a uniqueness framing argument for all their office. settler universities collapsing now due to material strategy, refusal but resistant models like the one I see rely on things like knowledge building, breathe life back into the university, and always end up redefining the settler academy. You should vote negative to orient towards that collapse, because that collapse is good and avoids all the dissets, solves the entirety of the F.
Okay, we're gonna run it.
Okay. 353 remaining. Let me send that to the chat. Order is going to be case K. No new cards or anything. Could you pass me the stand? Yeah, thank you. Got it. We'll give you a second. Oh, sorry. I didn't see the thumbs up. Is everybody good? Nobody became suddenly not ready? Okay.
Sorry, it's just case and then the K.
Just case and then K. Sorry about that. Thank you. All right. And start now. The world operates within an order of chaos that necessitates black female subjugation. Alliances are structured through a racialized dichotomy between the sovereign and subjected. Two impacts that are resolved by the affirmative around performance. First is white future earning investments and normative structures of alliances reify the security of the white future, justifying notions of civil violence, which their theorization fails to account for. Second is anti-black imperialism. U.S. imperialism structures domestic and international politics, which renders black women incapable of achieving full status citizenship. Their refusal to reckon with such liberal investments makes the negative complicit in that violence. Truth-telling is a process of world building that's fundamentally anti-capitalist and disarticulates the liberal state. That's some Malaklu evidence. The question of this debate is who provides a better strategy for black men to navigate spaces of violence, because they've once again conceded black men are precarious positions with academia. That's the hand evidence of women there. Black women to find some value in black spirituality or material conditions of the app that turns the alternative insofar as they expect to create some value, but their analysis sees black nations to white futures. Their extension to Grande on cases absolutely incoherent because they've conceded that the 1AC is generative and we are material action within the world. The examples of the 1AC look like Asada's daughters, look like Dawn Wood and truth telling against ICE, all of which have material implications for the world, which disproves all of their arguments. Other arguments are making are relying on them winning their theory of power, which we'll get to on the K. Go to the K. Central issue here. They dropped the permutation. We theorize blackness, anti-blackness, settlement, and imperialism. This should function as a filter for all of their offense because if we're winning cross-ex proves that the alternative is plan plus their explanation why theorization is bad. So we don't include native people, but the permutation resolves that by combining a multiplicity of theories on the world. This would resolve their arguments. Settler colonialism is already occurring. All of their arguments of decolonizing the classroom are also already happening. I'll handle their responses to do both. No, we don't use decolonization as a metaphor. It's a literal interpretation of decolonizing the way we think about problems and the way we speak about them, which is a prerequisite to any ground relationality. It also doesn't turn case because the relative impact of pushing out pedagogies of the flesh is battle fatigue and in worse instances death. Yes, you can have pedagogies of the flesh as indigenous people. We define it using their lived experience to inform knowledge production of the states. Now we only have to win the sequencing claim in the 1AC. All analysis on King should be a sufficient reason to vote affirmative that we're going to get to in a second. The permutation is net beneficial. We have impact turned their relationality link by saying using it is the only way to analyze the two will get cases a disad that we solve to. The Malaklu evidence is about how black women can disarticulate structures of power unless they believe that they can actually address the specificity of anti-black violence that the 1AC addresses. You should absolutely not vote negative. The specific link arguments that they are going for are all absolutely incoherent. The first argument they're extending is the structural analysis tuck and yang argument. The first claim they're making here is that failure to account for particularities of violence reproduce it, but this justifies the permutation. Pedagogies of the flesh are the only way to fully account for their particularities of violence because they account for lived experience. You cannot perfectly analyze from outside the body. The second argument they're making is an impact turn to truth telling because we learn more and change behavior, but technically I'm saying that's bad, but both of us are making a claim to generativity. We'll get to that on the alternative debate. This is an incoherent argument. The racialization link makes zero sense. We are impact turning this by saying racialization is good. The alternative is colorblind politics, which proves their conceptualization of anti-blackness is insufficient. Also, it's a double bind because all of their evidence says that they should be talking about anti-blackness and settler colonialism in conjunction, which means either they buy into theories of racialization and link, or they racialization is fine. They say yes, they recognize race as a particular category, but ask yourself how the 1AC moves beyond that. The culpability does that. They say their analysis is that their argument is that our analysis of the structure is violent, but that's not the claim that we're making. Our argument is that you have is that the 1AC talked about violence against black women, and you said no, you are culpable for not talking about every other instance of violence, which our argument is bad because black men are not responsible for that violence. The second decolonizing the mind argument that they're going for, the 1AC is not simply decolonization as a metaphor. We got to that above. The exceptionalism argument definitely proves the permutation. The only argument they're making here is that we said black female flesh is radically different, but your own authors agree with this. This is a ridiculous argument. We're going to get to that now. Go to the King evidence. Their explanation of King as a negative card is absolutely incoherent and misrepresents her arguments. Yes, King is analyzing the ways in which black female flesh is the necessary trope for settler expansion. It decidedly flows out because it describes the ways that settlement in fact requires black female bodies in order to constitute itself into figure native genocide. King's argument is not that settlement and anti-blackness both have explanatory power, but instead that both of these vectors of violence converge on black female bodies, which is a dissent to your alternatives focus on abstractions like ground of relationality rather than the figural conception of the black female body that becomes a ground basis for relationality. The master settler argument. They presume the AF has already thought the master, but not the settler, which belies a reductive reading of both blackness and indigeneity that configures blackness as always already not indigenous, not talking about coloniality. Our argument does not itself disappear the native. Their argument is symptomatic of a misreading of black scholarship because they fail to think about how the black women are configured by racialization, which is already itself an analysis of colonialism. Now, the alternative, or we're going to be extending Garba Sorrento, so go to the alternative. We're extending Garba Sorrentino 20. They have two arguments here. The first is that it's turned by King, but the analysis above definitely takes that out. To even be able to theorize that call, even through saying the co-constitutive stuff, Tuck and Yang have used land as a signifier, which black people cannot access. They missed the warrants in this card. The argument is that there is no land for the black person to recover. Yes, black geographies exist, but we can work out, but the only way to access those is working outside, which is the 1AC proves King flows out because it demonstrates identifying the slave's position as a prerequisite to understanding settler colonialism. They need our analysis, but we don't need theirs. The argument that scripts a Westphalian notion of control, that absolutely does not. It's an argument as to the assumptions that your scholars have made. Also, one last thing is framing. Let us weigh the case because that's the only way that black women can navigate an anti-black world, which is a prerequisite to their analysis. They say that navigating the world is not an endpoint, but it absolutely is a prerequisite because if you cannot navigate the world, you cannot even engage in debate or engage in the alternative. Now, the alternative itself, their explanation here is super bad and a huge issue for them because the argument that they are making is that it spills up towards collective resistance based on the politics and political theories which we forward here, which either means that one, we don't link because we also make a spill up claim, or two, they absolutely link because the only extent they don't actually defend any material action. The only thing they defend is a changing of the way you think about settlerism, which absolutely links to every single argument that they have made. Anything I'm missing? Okay. Also just yeah, that's good.
6.
Okay, that's fine. Zach, would you hand me a stand? Okay, is everybody good for an order? Okay, it is the case on top, then the K. Okay. Two conceded arguments frame this question. The first is the uniqueness frame. It's a question of the ways in which you relate to the inevitable collapse of the university, which means knowledge production alone is insufficient. Additionally, for winning of our link arguments, it means that the commodification component of this makes winning their offense inevitable, because it's just a question of what they generate in this debate, which I'm about to impact turn on the other page. Commodification becomes inevitable in a world of the F because it gets endlessly circulated and exported onto other people, which reproduces the sort of overcoming narratives, which you invest in more anti-black violence against black women, which turns all of their any of the capacity for the F to be good go to the K now. This debate is framed as a question of structural analytics and a praxis for material change. If we win that either the F structural analysis is wrong, or we have a better praxis for solving the sort of violence that they describe, you vote affirmative. There's no offense to their interpretation, just a question of the ways in which navigation, which I have impact turned into 2 and C and will continue to do so. Our argument is their desire to navigate forms of violence only teaches you how to live and navigate within the world. Only the alternative is a mechanism of overcoming and you're destroying the world that produces those forms of violence, which means you should vote for the alternative if it has any risk of solving any component of the affirmative. The exceptionalism arguments frame the way you evaluate the question of the link debate, because in order to vote affirmative, you have to agree that that black female flesh is sort of otherized and overdetermined as violence, and is the necessary condition for producing the world. The Leroy evidence says that analytic frame can only sort of subordinate indigenous demands as liberal multiculturalism, which invests in genocidal violence in order to generate their navigation, not even liberation, which turns the affirmative. That also turns the permutation, because it still includes the F and its a multiplicity of resistances, which will impact turn. Those are bad because they cause an infinite proliferation of meaning that only results in liberal multiculturalism, which is impact turned by our Bird and Leroy evidence. Now, I don't think they do a sufficient amount of work on the decolonization, not a metaphor debate. That alone should win the debate. Even if you think that they're right about everything they've said, their mechanism for producing change is a bad one. The Tuck and Yang evidence says that decolonization of the mind reproduces colonization as a metaphor and trades off with any material praxis or strategy. Think about this every time they talk about truth-telling, because it's always couched in revealing truth to produce meaning and resistance in the world. That becomes commodified and makes it impossible to ever generate genuine forms of resistance, because we think that merely knowing and understanding the world is sufficient, which always trades off with the alternative, which means that they're sort of theorizing endlessly about those things of world. That presupposes that freedom is mentally generative. That is bad. They've considered the 2 and C Tuck and Yang card about doing this, particularly through models of education and pedagogy, are particularly bad in an attempt to absorb colonization, which is itself violent, which the permutation is certainly in the business of. The culpability argument. No link to the culpability argument, because our link argument is about both the framing of the 1EC and the prescription, which means that we're not criticizing them for violence that they didn't cause, or for it's not a link of omission, which means that we're not making you culpable for all forms of genocidal violence, just the kinds that you perpetuate in your reading of the world. The So the Sorrentino evidence is impact turned by the one in our Robinson evidence that goes conceded. It turns any risk of their offense on this question. The Robinson evidence says that native sovereignty is itself a void because it is voided by the settler and transposed from the red body onto the settler. It answers the Sorrentino argument because it critiques the notion of blackness being non-positional, which means it's an impact turned to the AF. It also means that all of their structuralism arguments don't make sense because they exceptionalize the loss of black sovereignty when native sovereignty is also been voided. Their interpretation of their interpolation of land as a sovereign relation is parasitic. It also the thesis of our alternative impact turns the impact to the Sorrentino evidence because black people have access to space making practices which are good. The alternative solves 100% of both the criticism and the AF because it affords a decolonial ethic that produces material praxis to engage decolonization. That is something only we resolve because the AF promotes individualized politics that trade off with an analysis of the structural conditions that they critique. Only that destabilizes the settler master, which the King evidence, we both agree, says that the settler, the fluidity of the settler master is what produces violence against black women's bodies, which is something that only the decolonization project of the alternative can solve. It also is a better orientation toward the world because it means that we are effectuated toward a material praxis of the world. No answer to the grounded relationality debate. It solves exhaustion and black spirituality because it allows for new relations to create conversations about those spiritual attachments. Things like walking the land and urban farming projects, etc., are all ways in which black people can become placed in particular places in ways that overcome the sort of placeless dichotomy of the affirmative. That's our black geographies argument. It means that black people have cosmological conceptions of the land that should be talked about. The racialized dichotomy that writes blackness out of the sort of cosmological grammar is a violent mode of anti-black erasure that only the alternative's grounded relationality can solve. It also prioritizes the experience of black women, particularly on the land they find themselves on. That is above, which means that we solve at least some of their the theorizations of how black women are sort of positioned in the world through grounded relationality, and the alternative has an actual praxis to produce material change, which is not the F, which means there's only a question of whether or not the alt is better than the F.
We have 353 remaining. Case, then the K. I'll wait for everyone to come back. Okay, it looks like Jaleesa is back. Scannity, where are you at? Toyo, where are you at? Okay, they're all here. Cool, sounds good. Hey, Scannity. Okay. Vote AF at a time when the material conditions with which Black women exist are overcoded by the ways anti-Blackness is expropriated from the domestic to the international. Voting affirmative aligns yourself with our approach to politics. The truth-telling of the 1AC is an act of fugitivity that redirects our investments in normative alliance politics and rejects the notion of a future that we didn't choose for ourselves. We have two impacts that they don't do any work on. First is this notion of white futurity. Whiteness hides itself within the normative politics and makes active moves to secure a future for itself. Investments in normative structures of alliances reify the security of the white future, which justifies notions of civil violence. Second is anti-Black imperialism. U.S. imperialism is structured both domestically and abroad through anti-Blackness. This justifies endless interventionism and the manipulation of other countries via American politics. The truth-telling of the 1AC allows us to deconstruct notions of existing within space and time to create a moat outside of hegemonic frames of violence. This solves all of our impacts by allowing us to orient ourselves within this space towards a process of unthinking and breaking away from whiteness in politics. We've been very clear that our politics can result in material change. The warrant in Nate's response in the 1AR to the two arguments that they go for in the case debate is just not responded to, which is the internal link to all of their academy stuff. They also conceded that the academy stuff links back way harder to the decolonization stuff that they end up going for, because what is the difference between an ethic to produce material change and what the truth telling of the 1AC is? There's actually not one. And they don't respond to this in the 2NR. That's enough, right?
I sent you a thing.
The criticism. Weigh the affirmative and our impacts when we're doing a lot of analysis on the King evidence that they just blatantly don't respond to and re-explain. And our re-explanation of how settler colonialism is intertwined with anti-Blackness means that you should vote affirmative on the risk of us being right on the permutation. The Tiffany King is a Black feminist who is critiquing all of her work, across all of her work, humanist strains of Native studies that disavow and don't think that about with Black feminism. We have disads to their conception of what settlement means, because they assume settlement is bifurcated from Black women in order to generate competition. That assumption is Black femophobic and an incorrect theory of power, and the only way to garner competition with the affirmative, this answers all of the weighing stuff that they do at the top of the criticism in the 2NR, because we have a better explanation, and especially when you don't answer ours. King describes how settlement is, in order to legitimize its project, is needed a spatial trope through which it justifies expansion. This trope is the Black female body, which because of fungibility stands in as ground, the basis of relationality, and comes in to stand for the necessity of the settler trying to indigenize themselves. Framework of settlement and anti-Blackness gain of authority from Black, mapping the Black female body as a fungible trope of settlement and slavery. The AF is one that provides the correct starting point, because the affirmative figures Black women as simultaneously fungible, but lies in that fungibility provides an alternative of truth telling, which means if we're losing the framing debate, you should still prefer our theorization. They've dropped a permutation in the block, so there isn't it's not going to be really hard for us to win that the permutation's net beneficial. Permutation theorizes the anti-Blackness settlement and imperialism filter all of the offense they're winning through the permutation, because it proves the risk of the culpability. Dissent is unique to the alternative, and we have a method to resolve it. The permutation is just objectively true. We can combine all of our approaches via the politics of truth telling to understand how settler colonialism and anti-capitalism settler colonialism and anti-Blackness are co-constitutive. All of Nate's analysis at the bottom of the 2NR is a reason why, at the bottom of the 1AR is a reason why the alternative links back to all of their offense. They should not have gone for the decolonization as a metaphor link while conceding the alternative links back way harder. The Tuck and Yang do not critique merely saying the words decolonize, but rather using a political consciousness as an endpoint to your politics. They endorse the politics of inconsumability because they believe that embracing that knowledge within the debate spills up to how we address settlerism. This is the exact same claim to the generativity that they've critiqued in the 1AC. Think about the explanation that the 2NR goes for about what what is different between an ethic to create a different praxis to decolonize. Why is that different from truth telling as to create a different ethic to generate a new world? If we win, their ethic doesn't assume Blackness positionality to Blackness's positionality to land, then you should vote affirmative. They link back to all their offense. This takes out the alternative because it proves a negative ballot is nothing more than a settler's move to innocence. You end up assuaging your settler guilt by voting for an alternative, but that is not the material decolonization that their authors have endorsed. This is 100% 100% conceded. It was explicit on the link debate and the alternate debate in the 1AR, and they don't touch it. The multiplicity of pedagogies of the flesh is the only argument that they go for against the alternative, or against the permutation in the against the permutation in the 2 and R. Our argument is that the multiplicity of pedagogies of the flesh is better. You can think back to the cross-sex moment when I asked them how they would be able to deal with a native, white native person calling a black native person a nigger, and they had no explanation for how they would be able to resolve that because they can't understand the specificity or the racialization that occurs. That also proves that black female othering is a point, or like a point in which black women do experience violence that is unique to them, i.e. the hypersexualization of black women, i.e. like the reason why black women get commodified in media. All of the arguments that they go for on the case debate are uniqueness points for the affirmative, because it proves the necessity to think outside and deconstruct these structures of power, which the 1AC is a starting point to. If the alternative is also a starting point for that, then the permutation resolves it, and they going for the alternative as an ethic just makes no sense in the context of their link arguments. You can't vote negative. Good debate, y'all.
Great debate, y'all.
Yeah. Good debate,
Great debate, y'all.
Good debate, everybody.
Hi, everybody. We've got a decision. I see a lot of the competitors there, and I'm just waiting to make sure we've got all 3 Kansas City judges, and we'll be rocking and rolling. Oh, look at that. Toya's already. I didn't see it. I love it. And then if we just have Sean and Shalisa, I think will be. And Sean Kennedy and Jaleesa, I don't know if y'all can hear me, but we're good whenever y'all are around. And just heads up, Sean and Jaleesa, if y'all are nearby your computer, just let me know. We're good whenever y'all are.
I sent him a text, so they should be here soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Now, Kenny, you're the amazing one. And thank you to the debaters for your patience. And thank you for reaching out. And they should be with us in just a moment.
Brad, you want me to text Jay and Eskin?
No, Jay's here. She'll be back in just 1 second. Her dog was trying to poop on the ground.
Oh, no.
Wish I would be upset at the dog, but I honestly, he's so cute. I just let him shit on the ground.
All right. I think we've got everybody. Thank you all so much for all the hard work it took to get to an amazing Elite Eight debate at the 2021 CEDA National Championship. The winner on a 2-1 decision is the University of Central Oklahoma. Congratulations, y'all.
Congratulations, y'all. Good debate.
Great tournament, Wake Forest. Congratulations, y'all.
Congrats to everybody involved in this exchange. I ultimately ended up voting on the perm. I think that the AF does a pretty decent job and avoiding the exceptionalism kind of links in conversation. And we'll talk about the decolonization as a metaphor link in a second. But I think they do so by providing a co-constitutive analysis of the settler slave master kind of binary through the lens of the trope of the Black femme body. I don't think the neg does or meets them at the level of explanation for this king evidence that I think sets the landscape or the kind of lens for how I understand how this argument plays out. I think the evidence that they read does, wait, I don't think you, you don't really talk about this piece of evidence, thus you don't really dispute the reading of the evidence, which means the ass focus on the Black femme body does not supplant decolonization as much as it provides a coherence for the potential of relationality within it and for the coherence of, or the collection of both anti-Blackness and settler colonial theorization to have meaning contextually. I think with the decolonization as a metaphor link, it doesn't really get as much traction for me because I think you consistently can see this Don Wooten evidence, example, which explains and animates a lot of what the permutation looks like for me. I think improves how Black women's interrogations of anti-Black and settler colonial structures of power allows for them to engage in material fugitive strategies, or at least an orientation toward those types of material strategies that can decolonize, like the truth-telling or whistleblowing that she did on ICE. I also think that demonstrates the ability to both slip in and out of the worlds, as I forget which piece of evidence kind of refers to from the 1AC, where you say they need to be concerned with deconstructing realities. And I think that is a deconstruction of a reality without that coming at the expense of people like Don Wooten being able to imagine a world or create a reality outside of white futurity or things like that. So I don't think that there's a necessary trade-off in the world where the permutation is a material demonstration through this example of the fact that multiplicities can be good, that orientations toward multiplicities can be good, and that there is no trade-off with a decolonial orientation with Black women that truth tell. So to me, both the King evidence and kind of the Don Wooten example mixed with, I think, what are reasonable investments in the potential of the academy to absorb your scholarship, a lack of explanation for how the alternative translates itself into materiality in a very strong and meaningful way, and not beaten back against those examples. The permutation just kind of illustrates itself or animates itself in my mind as one that has the potentiality for Black flesh to be a lens and a focal point. I think the AF frames it as a starting point, but to not trigger the trade-off or the exceptionalism, the impacts of exceptionalism that your argument goes for. So I think the AF just kind of wins that debate, but it was a very enjoyable experience, a very, very good job debating by both sides.
Yeah, can you all hear us okay? Is that working? Okay, cool. Sorry.
I voted negative against a strategy of decolonization based on revealing truths about anti-Black or Indigenous violence in favor of a grounded relationality, i.e. a relationality to and from the land that can frame a multitude of outcomes of the alternative. I not only think their evidence does this, but for me in the debate, they give examples of repatriation, walking the line, grappling with placelessness, of some kind of like connection to urban lands. And there are like 2 or 3 others I think their evidence also gives. And these are things that I have from them. I think the negative is one, this debate is about competing structural analytics. And what's really frustrating for me is how close it is on the question of sort of this triadic understanding that foregrounds settlement and what you have, which is a focus on Black women's bodies that you have argued is intrinsic because they are a site for colonization of becoming this spatial trope. And so the reconciliation of those 2 analytics was really rough for me, 2NR, V2AR, but I think the negative is slightly ahead on that on the level of description and settlement being the important thing about the process, not just colonization of itself, which is why the grounded relationality stuff that I think is undercovered by the affirmative matters so much. I think they win this tuck and yang link about truth telling as more metaphoric or immaterial in comparison to the alternative. One of the things that I struggle with is everyone keeps saying something is material, immaterial, and it's like, everything that you're saying is material. The place that the question that I was like needs to become the focus of the debate for me is just like, you're absolutely right. If someone comes in here and starts saying nigger, nigger, nigger to Jaleesa, that's just real. It's material. Like it's no different than me going, than, giving me reparations. It is in comparison to one another, but not in an abstract, but the way that the negative is talking about it even though they're saying the AF isn't material, they're basically saying wrong kind of materiality. And I think thinking about it in that frame makes some of your other arguments a little bit more offensive. But absent that, I think they have effectively turned your white futurity impact and narrowed what offense the affirmative has to weigh against the alternative. That combined with, I think, the debating and the spin intentionally about the lower threshold of the alternative. They keep saying that even if we solve only a portion of the case, that should be enough, make it difficult for me to hold the alternative to a higher standard of what they have to solve. So ultimately, I think the alternative can solve some exhaustion. It can avoid a parasitic relationality with indigeneity and provide a better structural analytic than the affirmative. And the questions of why is this alt different from the AF I'm charged with answering by the affirmative are more than clear to me based on the 2 and R and based on some earlier block characterization. Again, the place that I thought and I was closest to, I don't know if I was the last in or not, but I spent a fair amount of time thinking through is this like kind of the permutation. I think some of on a technical level, the debating has to be cleaned up, but the more important piece is like, not just that the AF is a theorization of colonization, but how is settlement intrinsic to Black women's bodies? And how is settlement intrinsic to your world making? And how is the differential of you might be a little metaphoric versus you solve a large portion of their offense? So like both teams in this debate, the AF more than the other, we needed some impact calc comparison because it was so hard because I was like, fuck, the AF is definitely winning this. I'm with you. Yeah. I had a moment where I was like, oop, they better have some answers because that is some real shit. And there were a couple other places in the 2 hour I was like, yeah, that seems about right. Yeah. And then I was like, for the neg though, I was like, oh, but it seems like they keep saying you're real metaphoric and that's kind of parasitic. You can't collapse genocide into our shit. And you're just like, well, not really. And I'm like, well, I don't know. And then I looked at the debate and then I was like, well, I guess, but I'm unsatisfied with my decision, but that's ended up how I vote and how I saw the debate.
Yeah, I think I saw the debate pretty similarly to Jay. The thing for me, so the way I agree about the link about, decolonization of the mind or as a metaphor or whatever. I think that this is not the most useful language, much like Julie said, that materiality is not really what you're talking about per se. I think what you want to be saying, and this is how I understood it, because to be fair, I thought your cross-ex of the 1AC on truth telling was very good, and that you were pretty clear about this as the debate progressed. That you are talking about knowledge and language as being instrumentally useful for like burning down settler colonialism. And they are talking about them as being ends in themselves and as forms of like radical self-actualization or radical energy building or whatever. And you're saying, no, you can't treat those things as ends in themselves because then it's impossible to move outside of the flesh and to grapple with an analytic of the lands. And I think instrumentality is the language that you want to be using, not materiality. Because I agree with Jay that I mean, frankly, the AF had like a 30 level CX on language as material. And it was like, well, that's not great. So I think you definitely have to just be more clear about the language that you're using to characterize this link argument. And then I agree too, just like, I thought for me by the end of the debate, this King evidence, I think that the negative is not contesting this in the way that the affirmative thinks that they are, if that makes sense. And it seems like I think you all sort of by the end of the debate were like, a little bit, but in sense, like I was watching you all talking to each other and I was like, okay, I think I see what happened here. Because I think if you were up just a little bit more on the alt and grounded relationality, then I would have voted affirmative. Particularly because, like I said, the negatives explanation of this other link argument was not super clean. And you all were getting some traction and you were winning that language is material by the end of the debate. So it was just a better argument about grounded relationality. And I think I'm voting affirmative. And it was I thought it was an excellent debate. It was really close. A lot of really smart tactical and theoretical moves by both sides. And frankly, something that I struggle with sometimes in KVK debates is they're just like kind of messy, like organizationally. This debate was very organizationally clear and very easy to follow. And you took a lot of really dense stuff and like made it easy to understand by the end of the debate. The other thing I'd say for the affirmative is I think you need a better answer to this grande uniqueness argument about the academy collapsing, because that creates some real problems for truth telling being offensive as a thing in itself. and you're kind of pot committed on winning that the alt also is a metaphorical or immaterial in order to answer that argument. And so because I didn't think that that characterization was like wholly accurate of what their link argument is vis-a-vis the alternative, I ended up thinking that like, well, the academy is going to collapse, and truth telling is in some way maybe not dependent on the academy per se, that's probably a little bit unfair, but is dependent on spaces of knowledge production, since it exists at the level of knowledge production as a good in itself, if that makes sense. And therefore it's very prone to getting swept away with the tide when the academy inevitably collapses, if that makes sense. No, I thought it was a great debate.
Congrats and good luck to everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Also, Derek and Mary wanted to say hi to you all, like everyone on the panel, because he watched this round. You can't really see them because they're not unmuted, but if you're watching this, Derek and Mary, they say hi.
What's up, Derek and Mary?
What's popping? Welcome to, and I hope you've enjoyed a beautiful quarters experience. Go Deeks all day long.
Thank you all so much.
Go Deeks.
All so much.
Thank you.
Go Broncos as well. D3 love in the building.
Thank
We
you.
love that.